record. Okay. Today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos Daf Daled. We're going to start on Gimel Amud Beis, approximately 6 lines from the bottom. All of our Torahs that we study in the month of March is sponsored by our friend Gray in memory of her brother Bobby, her mother Beverly, her grandmother Grace. May their neshamas have an aliyah. So we're going to start on 3b, 6 lines from the bottom. That Talmud has been discussing yesterday. The Talmud discussed yesterday, how do we know that if there is a relative who falls to Yibum, falls to levirate marriage, and under those circumstances, we say Yibum doesn't apply. So if it's, for example, the source for this idea comes from your wife's sister. A person's not allowed to marry his wife's sister, and if she falls to Yibum, say if your wife's sister marries your brother, then we don't, and he dies, then we don't do Yibum. And this is based upon the fact that the verse says Aleha, Aleha by the wife's sister, and by Yibum, and that teaches us that we don't do Yibum with the wife's sister. Nevertheless,
Rabbi, quick question. Can you
Yes.
just do a quick review? What is the overarching, what are the drivers for that prohibition? You said that it was not primarily, genetic inbreeding, but why is it?
Let's come back to that at the end. We'll get there at the end, and we'll go over those questions. So the Talmud says, so what's the reason why this prohibition applies? That even that you don't do Yibum with your wife's sister, because it says the word Aleha. Halav hachi. So where this not the case, Havamina, I would say, Achos Isha Miya Bemes. Your wife's sister, you do Yibum. My time, and what's the reasoning? The Amrinan Asi Asay Vidachi Los Asay. Because we say comes along a positive commandment and overrides a negative commandment. So what's the reason why we need a verse to tell us that you don't do Yibum with your wife's sister? Even your wife's sister is a prohibited relationship with you. So why would we need a verse to tell us you don't do it? Because otherwise we would say that the positive commandment of doing Yibum overrides a negative commandment of being with one's wife's sister. And we have a basic principle of a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. And so we would have said that you would do Yibum with your wife's sister, because this is the basic principle from the Torah, from the rabbis. Asi asay v'docho os asay, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. So the Gemara says, well, Amar damrinan asi asay v'docho os asay v'os asay greater. Maybe we say a positive commandment comes along and overrides a negative commandment. Maybe that's just by a regular negative commandment. But this is a more intense negative commandment. This is a negative commandment. If one is with a prohibited relationship, you're going to get the severe penalty of kares. Midachi, would we really say a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment in those circumstances? And before the Gemara answers that question, the Gemara goes back and says, let's just take a step back. How do we know this principle, which we have throughout the Talmud, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? What is our source for this idea that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? So the Gemara says the source for this idea is that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment is because it states lo sobash shatnes. It says you're not allowed to wear so we're on top of 4a. It says in Deuteronomy, you're not allowed to wear shatnes. Shatnes is wool and linen garments that are, the threads of wool and linen are mixed together in the garments. You're not allowed to wear such a garment. Gidilim taselach. You shall make gidilim. You shall make gidilim or tzitzis. The mitzvah of tzitzis, of putting fringes on your garments. So from the fact that these two verses are written next to each other, Rabbi Lazar says, Smuchim min haTorah minayin. These two verses are next to each other, and so we're able to expound them because of the proximity of these two verses one to each other. And how do we know they're allowed to expound? Now, when we have two verses that are written next to each other, we can derive a teaching from them. So that's what Rabbi Elazar says. Smuchim min haTorah minayin. How do we know we can derive a teaching from the fact that the verses are written next to each other? Shenemar smuchim la'ad olam asuyam be'emes v'yashar. It says in the verse in Psalms that the things that are next to each other, smuchim la'ad olam asuyam be'emes v'yashar, that they are true and just. So therefore, we expound passages that are next to each other. The Amar of Sheish is Amar Rabbi Elazar, Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So now we're going to give another example of two verses that are next to each other. And because they're next to each other, we expound a teaching from these verses. So again, we start off by saying, how do we know a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? We learned that law out from the fact that the prohibition of shatnez is next to the mitzvah of tzitzis. So that means you're allowed to do the positive commandment of tzitzis by even overriding the negative commandment of shatnez. So even if there's wool and linen on your tzitzis, together you can wear the garments because the positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. And now we're going to give another, because the two verses are next to each other, we expound them. And now we're going to give another example of a positive, of where we make an inference from the fact that the two verses are next to each other. And this is actually it just happens to be that this is an example from the topic of our discussion of today, of this tractate, which is Yevamos. Because we say, Minayo Yevama Shenafo Ifnei Mukashlim. How do we know that a Yevama falls before a Mukashlim? How do we know that if a woman who falls to Yibam and her brother-in-law is somebody who's physically repulsive to her, he has with boils on his body, she doesn't want to marry him, that we don't say to her, be quiet. We don't mute her. How do we know we don't mute her? And that we listen to her and we force the brother-in-law to do chalitza, to break the relationship and not to marry her, because it states in the verse in Deuteronomy that you're not allowed to muzzle an ox while it is threshing. And we derive from that verse, and next to it, the immediate verse next to it is Ki Yeshu Achim Yachtav, when the two brothers are dwelling together. Rav Yosef said, so from the fact that they're next to each other, we see from here that just like you're not allowed to muzzle an ox while it's working, so too there's another creature that you can't muzzle, an entity, and that's a woman who says she doesn't want to be married to this brother-in-law because he's filled with repulsive physical appearance. Therefore, she has the right to say, I don't want to be with him. The Amar of Yosef, so that's another proof that you make a drush about verses that are next to each other. And comes along Rav Yosef and says, even according to the position that says in the other four books of the Torah, the Bereshit, Shmos, Vayikra, and Bamidbar, the other four books of the Torah, we don't do smuchim. Even according to that position, that we don't do. In Mishnah Torah, we do make this. We do make this drasha. In Mishnah Torah, we do make this drasha. Even according to the position that we don't make smuchim in general, in Deuteronomy, we do make these expositions. Deuteronomy is written differently than all the other four books of the Torah. Deuteronomy is written comes from, even though it's all from Hashem, it was, so to speak, reformulated by Moshe Rabbeinu. So even though we don't make this context of this proximity of these passages in the other four books of the Torah, there's opinion that says that we do with the other four books, that we do make drashas by the proximity. But even the one that says we don't, when it comes to Deuteronomy, we do. Now, Rabbi Yehuda ba'amal odarish. Rabbi Yehuda in general does not make drashas about the proximity of passages. Uba Mishnah Torah darish, but by Deuteronomy he does make such a drasha. Now the Gemara says Uba alma minawan do darish, and how do we know in general that in general he doesn't make such a drasha? How do we know that Rabbi Yehuda in general does not make such a drasha by the other four books of the Torah, that he doesn't make expositions from the proximity of the passages? And the Gemara tells us because it says in a brayso, the Tanya Ben Azai Omer, Ben Azai says, Mechashefa osechaya. Mechashefa, that somebody who's a sorceress is not going to be able to live. And it also states, Kol shochev and behima mos yumas. And whoever says whoever lives with an animal, we put to death. So Samchu and Yanlo. So we place the two passages next to each other because it says a sorceress cannot live, and next to that sorceress it cannot live who's in Exodus and Mishpatim, it says that an animal is put to death. And we know that an animal, how is this animal put to death? Rashi tells us how, because it says about this animal, it says the mayhem bomb, and whenever it uses that expression, the mayhem bomb, it means with stoning. So just like the animal is stoned with stoning, is killed with stoning, the animal and the woman who sleeps with the animal is killed with stoning. So too, so too the sorceress is killed with stoning. So from the proximity of the passages, that's how we derive it. So Amrullah Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yehuda does not make this drush of the Smichus Parshas. He does not expound the proximity of the passages. He says, because these two passages are next to each other, that reason we're going to execute this woman by stoning, just by the fact that one verse is next to each other. No, that's not the source for the reason that we execute this sorceress. What's the source for the idea that we know we're supposed to stone the sorceress? It comes from the prohibition of oviudoni, which is a subset. It's a specific type of magician or sorceress listed in Parshas Vayikra. Because oviudoni b'chal mechashefim hayu, they're really part of witches. The Lama Yatsu. So why is the Leviticus repeat the prohibition of an oviudoni? To compare them to Lakishlam, to compare them to the concept of the mechashefa, and to tell us ma oviudoni b'skila, just like oviudoni is put to death by stoning, af mechashefa b'skila, so to a sorceress is put together with stoning. But from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda does not, we see from here that in the book of Exodus, Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim, he doesn't derive anything from the proximity of the passages. And this teaches us that throughout the 5 books of Moses, Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim. However, the Mishnah Torah we know on the Darish. How do we know that Mishnah Torah? We do make this drasha, the Tanan, because we state, no say Adam. How do we know that Rabbi Yehuda does make this drasha of smuchim when it comes to Deuteronomy? How do we know that he does expound upon the proximity of the verses? Because it states, we learned in the Mishnah, no say Adam anusas avim mufusei savim. According to the rabbis, the Tanakama here, a person is allowed to marry, a son is allowed to marry the anus of his father and the mufusas of his father. What's the anus of his father? His father, Rahman al-Atzlan, assaulted a woman sexually, and so such a woman, the son is now allowed to marry her, even though the father had a sexual interaction with her. And also mufoses of him. If the father didn't, if this is where he seduced her, he had a sexual interaction with this woman, which was not his wife, the son is allowed to marry her. That's what the Mishnah says. And so too, Anusas beno, Mefusas beno. So too, if a son has that type of interaction with a woman, the father is allowed to marry her. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda, Oser b'anusas av Mefusas of Rabbi Yehuda prohibits such a relationship. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're not allowed to marry a woman who your father was your father's anusa or mefusas. Why? My time with Rabbi Yehuda. What's the basis for Rabbi Yehuda's prohibition? Because it says in the verse in Deuteronomy, the verse says a man is not allowed to marry his father's wife, and he cannot reveal the corner of his father's garment, his father's garment. Kanaf Sharab Aviv, the garment that his father saw, he's not allowed to reveal. And so therefore that's a reference to a woman who was a anus or mefusas of his father. So the Gemara asks, how do we know that lo yigaleh kanaf aviv is referring to this anus, or this woman who his father was with outside of marriage? And the Gemara explains, from the fact that right above it, the previous verse was v'nasana isha shochay bima. The previous verse was discussing what you have to do if you're with a woman against her will. What is the punishment? That's called v'nasana isha shochay bima. That's called an anusa. You have to give avia na'arach mishim kesef. The Torah requires a monetary payment to the father of such a girl. And the next verse includes within it yikach ish as Eishes Aviv, so from the fact that there's a proximity of these verses, we learn from here that you're not allowed, that a son is not allowed to be with the anusa of his father. The Rabbanan, the rabbi said, no, if the two verses, those two words were exactly right next to each other, but even though the verses, the way we count them are right next to each other, there's a phrase in between. Because it doesn't just go straight from the anusa to lo yigaleh kinaf aviv. It includes in between lo yikach Eishes Aviv. So therefore, but now that the two verses are not right next to each other, therefore the rabbis say refers to something else. The shomeres yavam, the Torah is referring to a shomeres yavam. What's a shomeres yavam? That if your father's brother dies and now his wife falls to Yibum with your father. So under such a circumstance, that's called she has a connection to him. Even if he hasn't gone through with the Yibum yet, she has a connection. It's called a Shomeres Yavam. And under those circumstances, there's already a prohibition to be with your father's brother's wife. But here we're saying that it's teaching us an additional prohibition. Shomeres Yavam akasav medaber to say you're in violation of two prohibitions. That's what this verse is teaching us. You're in violation of your father's brother's wife, and also Mishnah Torah my time at the Darish. So now the Gemara asks a more general question: why is Rabbi Yehuda willing to expound drashas from proximity in Deuteronomy? The Gemara says there's two possible reasons about why he's darshing them. One reason is because it's muchach, and one reason is because it's mufnei. What is muchach and what is mufnei? Muchach means, and this is much more the case in Deuteronomy, it's clear that there was another verse where basically the context of where this verse was written, it should have been written elsewhere. Like, for example, the Arayos passage, the prohibited relationships, the main passage there is in Leviticus. So why is it saying it here? The main context should have been in Leviticus. And the fact that it's mentioned here tells us to make a drasha to the proximity of the passages. Or mufnei means it was unnecessary to say it. This concept that it's being repeated in Deuteronomy for no reason. So if you want to say it's because it really could have been written elsewhere, because this passage of the prohibited relationships should have been written in Leviticus. So why is it being mentioned here in Deuteronomy? To teach us to expound upon the proximity of the passages. And some say because of it's unnecessary to say it because it was superfluous. The Torah could have just said, do not take your father's wife. What do we learn out from the fact that it says, why does it have to say, do not reveal his garment? Why is that added on? We're on top of 4b. So it's extra. And so therefore we can expound it. So according to the one who says that we only expound it when it's extra, when it's mufneh, we're on top of 4b. By tzitzis also, we could either say it's muchach, meaning to say the real passage should have been elsewhere, or mufneh, because it was unnecessary to repeat it. We could say it should have been written elsewhere. The main passage is by tzitzis. That's where it should have been written. That's in Shalach. Why is it being written here? Because it's to expound upon the proximity of the passages. And so therefore, why was it written here? And according to the approach, it says because it's mufneh, because it's not necessary to write here. Since it already states it's extra here, it's not necessary, because we already have a verse in Leviticus that tells us not to wear shatnes. What's that verse? It says, and on the garments of kohanim of shatnes you should not wear. So if that's the case, why in Deuteronomy does it have to repeat this prohibition of wool linen together of shatnes? So what was still about shatnes lamale? Why does it repeat the prohibition of shatnes? So the answer is shvamino afnuye. So therefore it's extra, and so therefore it's to give us this drasha. Gemara says, wait 1 second. You think it's extra about shatnes? No, we need the verse in Deuteronomy about shatnes. It's not extra. Because if we only had the verse from Vayikra, don't put the shatnes on you. I might have said from the lashon, from the words of the verse in Vayikra, I might have said no. Kol derech ha'olah asur, that anything is prohibited, any way in which you wear it. Even if you're just wearing, they used to wear a lot of garments at the time as the way they were selling them. So you're obviously not wearing it for benefit. I would have thought that was prohibited. But Kasav Rahmana was so bashanes. Therefore, the Torah says, do not wear the garment. It has to be worn to be prohibited in a manner in which you derive benefit from it. There has to be benefit. Because of Rahman Silbash, and if we just had the verse of Silbash, Avamina Dafka Lavisha, the Nafesh Aniyasa, when is it prohibited? Only when you wear it, there's a lot of benefit. But to just drape it over your shoulders like a scarf, well, that's not prohibited. So therefore, Kasam Rahmana, I might have thought that's not prohibited. So therefore, Kasam Rahmana Ya'alecha. So therefore it writes Ya'alecha. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. So we understand why the Torah needs to write Yobash Shanes and Ya'alecha. But in King Lichtov Rahman was so Bashanes. So I understand why it says don't wear the Shanes to teach us that it's only if you're deriving benefit from it. But Samar Pishtim Lamaway. Why does it have to repeat wool and linen together? Why does it have to repeat the prohibition of wearing wool and linen? We would have known that without it, because since it states in Leviticus, you're not allowed to wear a garment of shatnes. V'tanid Rabbi Shmuel, the Academy of Rabbi Shmuel taught, since sometimes the Torah just says garments, and one of those places by the garments of the Torah, it specifies Samar Pishtim, it specifies wool and linen. We learned from here, I've called Samar Pishtim. Anytime it mentions that every garment, when the Torah refers to a garment, it means a garment of wool and linen, or wool or linen. So if that's the case, Samar Pishtim, the Kasam Rahman Olamoi. So why does it have to repeat in Deuteronomy Samar Pishtim, since it says in Vayikra a garment of Kolaim you cannot wear? We know that that's wool and linen. So every garment is wool and linen. So why does it have to say? Why does it have to repeat it here? Shema Minolef Nuye. So it must be that it's extra to give us this drasha about that you can wear tzitzis, you can wear shanes on your tzitzis. Gemara says Vakati Yitzrach. No, but we still need. It's not mufneh. Why? Because Salvadaita Chamina Allah He Delo Nafesh Anasa. We might have thought that putting it on, draping it on yourself, where there's not a lot of benefit, that's where it's prohibited to have wool and linen together. Where there the prohibition is only limited to wool and linen. Avalavisha, but wearing it, the nafesh aniyasa, where you have a lot of benefit. Kol trein mine yasar rachmana. I might have thought there that every mixture of fabric is prohibited, not just wool and linen. That's what I might have thought. So therefore, kasam rachmana samar pishin. Therefore, the Torah says wool and linen cannot be worn. Gemara says, no, imkain lishtok kra mina mine. The Torah wouldn't have needed to say anything, because v'teisi shatnes meha'ala, because we could have learned out from the fact that it says shatnes in Vayikra and shatnes in here, and we would have learned that it only refers to wool and linen together. So for the fact that it repeats it, it's extra to teach us this concept that you're allowed to wear wool and linen on your tzitzis. Mara says, well, wait, Vitana Deve Rabbi Shmuel, according to this Academy of Rabbi Shmuel, what's the reason? Taima, what's the reasoning? Because of Rahmana. According to Tana Rabbi Shmuel, what's the reason why we know that it's extra, and therefore we could say you can wear wool and linen by tzitzis, is because the Torah writes Semra Pishtim, is because it writes Semra Pishtim. But where if the Torah didn't write wool and linen, I would say I would have said otherwise that wool and linen like tzitzis have asur rachmana, that the Torah prohibits wearing wool and linen on tzitzis. But would we really say that? But there's another verse that says v'asulam tzitzis al kamfei v'gdeihem. It says you shall make tzitzis on the corners of your garments. Betan de Berishmo, and Rabbi Shmuel's academy taught, Kol begadim, all garments are tzemer pishtamim, are wool and linen. V'amarachmana, and the Torah is telling us, avid le tcheles. The Torah is saying, put tcheles on the corner of your garment, and that garment is linen, or can be linen, and you have to put wool, v'tcheles amarahu. And tchelos is wool. And how do we know that tchelos is wool? And the fact that the Torah by the Kohen's garment refers to sheish, and that's linen. So therefore, tchelos amarahu. So therefore, tchelos is wool. And so therefore, we would have anyway known that you're supposed to put wool fringes on a linen garment for tzitzis, or you can do it. And so therefore, we would anyway know that you're allowed to wear tzitzis made out of wool and linen. And if that's the case, then this verse is not needed to teach us. Then we would have anyway known that. So why do we need this extra verse of Tzemer Pishtim to teach us from the proximity of the passages that you can wear wool and linen on your tzitzis? The Gemara says, no, it's strich. No, we still need that verse because you might have said to use these teachings like Rava. Because what did Rava say? The Rava threw two verses against each other. One verse states ha-kanaf. One verse states al tzitzis kanaf pesil techeles, and which means min kanaf, which means that you have that the fringes should come from the type of material as your garments. The ksiv tzemer pishtin, and also says wool and linen, together, which means okay, tzad tzemer pishtin potrin bein b'minan bein shelo b'minan, that the wool and linen exempt are good for tzitzis, their work, whether the material, the garment itself, is made out of wool and linen or a different type of material. But shar minin, but all other material, b'minan potrin, shelo b'minan ein potrin, they only work if it's the same type of material. So the Gemara says, V'atan Berishmo, Leislei the Rava. V'atan Berishmo does not agree with that teaching of Rava. He doesn't expound that. So for him, he doesn't need. What does he do with Tzemer Pishtim? So the Gemara says, it's strach. No, he does need it. Because you might have thought to say Kidiyuka de Rava. He might have thought to say like the inference of Rava, meaning to say hakanaf min kanaf, and that the fringes need to be like the garment. And the Torah is telling us avilay tzemer with tzemer, pishtim with pishtim, v'chayavidas tzemer with tzemer, save. Aval tzemer with pishtim, pishtim with tzemer will cause well. So therefore, kaser rachmana tzemer upishtim dafiu tzemer upishtim with tzemer. The Torah is telling us that you can. The Torah is telling us that you should make a woolen fringe for a woolen garment, or a linen fringe for a linen garment. But when you make a woolen fringe for a woolen garment, then you dye it. But when you make a woolen fringe for a linen garment, you don't need to tie the tcheles. And so therefore the Torah is telling us Tzemer Pishtim that even if you make a woolen fringe for a linen garment or a linen fringe for a woolen garment, that you still dye it with the tcheles too. Okay, well, just to summarize, before we go back to Grace's question, to summarize, the Talmud was asking, how do we know this concept of a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? We learn it out from the proximity of tzitzis to wool and linen together, which teaches us that is learned out from the fact that we expound verses that are next to each other, and what gives us the license to do that? Because these verses are either written in the wrong place, meaning to say it would be better for them to be written in another place in the Torah, more logical, or else because the verses are redundant or unnecessary because whatever it's teaching was already taught already. So therefore, we use it for a drasha. Okay, I want to go back to Grace's question and answer Grace's question.